Eloise Todd, Executive Director and Co-founder, Pandemic Action Network. Pandemic Action Network came into existence in March and April 2020. When the COVID pandemic hit, a group of like-minded activists got together to pull together civil society voices and others across society, foundations, media organizations, private sector, our belief being that you need everybody to come together and push to make sure that governments make the right choices in times of crisis, and that they make the right choices to make sure that every country in the world is better prepared to stop future outbreaks turning into deadly and costly pandemics. Right now, we're at 350 organizations strong, 3 years in. We are spread across 4 continents, and with the power of our collective voice and the collective wisdom across different sectors, we want to make sure that pandemics are understood as a cross-societal, whole-of-government issue that needs not just the health sector, but finance, education, employment, social welfare. All of these people, everybody in society needs to make sure and has an interest in making sure we are better prepared to stop future outbreaks from becoming pandemic. With pandemic prevention and preparedness, it's not a case of us not knowing what we need to do to help stop outbreaks become pandemics. It's been a case of a lack of political will. There was a particularly influential report in May 2021 by the independent panel on pandemic preparedness and response led by Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf and Helen Clark, which made some actionable recommendations, and we also fight to put those into practice. One of those was a push for a pandemic fund to make sure that countries around the world have the resources needed to fill the country level gaps they have in policies to make sure they're better prepared to fight future pandemics and to stop outbreaks from becoming epidemics. The biggest challenges that we face are political apathy. We really need to make sure that politicians who are busy with their domestic issues, with crises in the world from energy to food to war, that they do not forget that actually with onset of climate change and the growing climate, the pandemics are more and more likely to occur more frequently, and therefore we need to take more action now to prevent them from becoming deadly and costly in future. We talk about future pandemics, but it's really important for us all to remember and to act on the fact that COVID-19 is still very much with us. It's still mutating, it's still infecting people, and it's still costing lives. It's just that political attention has moved on, and of course with at least the vaccine rollout having got part of the way there, but not all of the way there, particularly in low and middle income countries, there's still a big hill to climb. People are better protected, but we still haven't got to the most vulnerable in the world and the hardest to reach. So we cannot stop in our efforts to also roll out countermeasures, whether that's vaccines, treatments, testing for COVID-19. And we have to make sure that, especially for low and middle income countries, that they have the resources needed to do that, because they have other health concerns that they need to spend their budgets on. This is why some of the international moves to create more financing streams for pandemic preparedness and prevention, like the Pandemic Fund, are so important. Right now, we still have a lot of work to do to make sure we're better prepared for future pandemics. We know a lot of what we need to do, but we need political attention to do it. A lot of health ministers are back to their usual domestic focus when we also need that international eye on what's going on. We also need a range of skills at the table. During the COVID-19 crisis, many countries had a kind of war room approach to the pandemic. They had their employment ministers, their finance ministers, health, education, social welfare sitting around the table deciding what was needed to be done. We need the same approach for pandemic prevention and preparedness. We need that always on approach. We do that for fire, we do that for defense, but we haven't yet done that for pandemics. We cannot simply burst into life unorganized when a pandemic strikes or when the threat of a pandemic is round the corner. And one of the other important things we absolutely need to do is to increase the international cooperation around health threats and pandemic threats. One of the things that is happening this year in 2023 in September is a high-level meeting at the United Nations. That will be the first time that world leaders have got together at the UN on the pandemic. It's quite hard to believe that 3.5 years after we called the pandemic, that will be the first time leaders will meet. We are saying that we need some kind of global pandemic threats council to meet on a more regular basis at the level of national leaders to be able to overcome some of the problems, hurdles, diplomacy and negotiations needed to make sure we're prepared, so that in future we don't have a world in which only rich countries have access to vaccines, tests and treatments, that we don't have a world in which there's a lot of investment in vaccines but everybody forgets about treatments and tests, and that we get to the people on an equitable basis so that every life is treated equally. Global collaboration is vital. If a COVID-19 or any future pathogen mutates in a different country, we know that the pathogens do not respect borders. The idea that we can tackle a pandemic alone is a fallacy. In the same way that we have to tackle climate change internationally, it's exactly the same for pandemic threats. Plus, the link between those two things is very strong. As we face a rising climate, which we see in all of our countries with rising temperatures, sporadic weather patterns, and increased wildfires, those things will also increase the incidence and likelihood of disease outbreaks and epidemic threats that could become pandemics. So with all of that on the horizon, it's absolutely essential that we get organised. And the good news for leaders is that the investment that it will take to look at pandemics and properly address pandemic preparedness and prevention is a fraction of the cost that we just had for the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of money and in terms of lives. There's no good reason not to do this. It needs some political attention. We have some hope that India in its G20, with a focus on a pandemic countermeasures platform, a digital health fund, and other aspects of the pandemic, we really hope that it will take that work forward internationally and bring in leaders from low and middle income countries as well as the most powerful G20, so that we build a world in which we're properly prepared for the future. As an organisation, Pandemic Action Network is tracking the pandemic accord process. We are working towards the high-level meeting at the UN in September, and we're really keenly focused on the G20 of India, with India being in the driving seat, having such a strong voice internationally on some key issues around intellectual property, around vaccine production, and the knowledge that India has of these issues. We feel very hopeful that we can make some progress on these issues towards September, and we'll be offering our support to make as much progress as possible and urging leaders to do what they can to capitalise the pandemic fund, which only needs 10.5 billion a year, relatively small amounts of money given the returns that we could get from that. And we really hope we can work together to do that this year. And beyond that, we will be looking at the health track in the COP process because of that interconnection between health and climate change and the increased risk of disease threats and zoonotic spillover that could lead to future pandemic threats.